Hi, my name is Lila Gardunia, and today I'm going to show you how to make this cute stretched 16 patch quilt block. It's fast, it's fun, it's a great way to play with your fabric, and it goes together super quick and easy with virtually no scraps. You can make the blocks in bright colors like these, or you can use muted tones, dark tones. It looks great with everything. This is a great way to play with your fabric and just have fun sewing. All right, let me walk you through it.
You only need a few supplies to make a stretched 16 patch block. First, fabric. Each block requires two fabrics, a lighter and a darker fabric. Make sure there is a good amount of contrast, light and dark, between the two fabrics. You'll need about a fat eighth of each fabric for the block. You'll need a ruler for cutting, rotary cutter, maybe some pins, it goes together pretty easily, and a sewing machine, and an ironing board. Let's get started. You can cut the pieces for the stretched 16 patch block out of yardage or fat quarters. Each block needs two strips of fabric that are 3.5 inches wide and at least 19 inches long. So a fat quarter is usually about 21 inches long, and I don't really like cutting super long strips, so I'm going to fold it in half here. And we need two strips that are 3.5 inches wide. Now be sure that you're cutting along the long edge that's 20 to 21 inches long instead of across the shorter edge parallel to the selvage, which is only going to be 18 inches long. Again, we're going to line up a line on our ruler with the fold up there, so we make sure that the strip is nice and straight. We'll trim up the edge and then cut two pieces that are 3.5 inches wide. You can trim these two strips to 19 inches long, but that kind of takes extra time, so I just leave them extra long. There is also enough fabric in this fat quarter to cut two more 3.5 inch wide strips that you could use in a second block. In addition to cutting out of fat quarters, you can also just use your yardage. And these blocks, what I love most about them is that they're a fun chance to use your favorite fabrics. Things that you might not normally use, those prints that you've been saving for a special occasion. Again, lining up the folds, evening up the edge. We're just going to cut off one 3.5 inch strip. Now, because this is yardage, this strip is going to be about 42 inches long. So we need at least 19 inches. So that means we can either trim this down, measure, cut it down to exactly 19 inches, or we can just cut at the fold and have two strips that are about 21 inches long. I hate measuring, so this is my preferred method. All right, that's all the cutting we need to do. Now, let's get to the sewing. It's very simple and straightforward sewing. We're going to be sewing the fabrics, every other fabric, light, dark, dark, light, dark, light, we're going to want the dark fabric to be in the upper left-hand corner of our block. And that'll just help keep the light, dark pattern going across the quilt. So step one, we're going to sew them together into a slab like this. So I'm going to kind of pin these so I remember which side I'll be sewing along. There are no points to line up, nothing fancy that we need to do. So I'm not going to pin the whole length of the strip. This is just to help remind me which side I'm sewing on. So let's go over to the sewing machine and get these sewn together. Before we start sewing, I'm going to prepare my sewing machine. I've put on a 1/4 inch foot, and my 1/4 inch foot has a little guard here, so I can't move the fabric over more than 1/4 inch. I'm changing my stitch length and reducing it to about a 1.8. The 1.8 is pretty short, but it will help keep our stitches and units from pulling apart when we subcut this long strip. So we're just going to get started. Set it at a 1/4 inch. All right, no need to backstitch. I'm just going to match the edges of the fabric and sew down the length of the strip. I'll sew down the length of the second strip, again matching the edges and stitching a 1/4 inch seam with a short 1.8 stitch length. Now at this point, I'll cut these apart, and we could sew these two strips together, but I find pressing goes better when I press them separately before I sew them back together. So let's go press. For each of the strips, we'll press towards the darker fabric, but before we press it open, I'm going to set the seam. That's simply putting my iron on top of the seam for a few seconds. That helps integrate the stitches into the fabric and will help the seam open better, more straighter, if you will. So, all right, so I'm kind of giving it a pre-press with my finger. And then I like to use the tip of the iron to push the fabric to the side and get that seam all the way open. And then just push it open and hold it for a few seconds all the way down the length of the strip. And then I repeat for the second strip. All right, now that they're pressed, we're going to sew the two strips together. Dark, light, dark, light. We'll be using the same 1.8 stitch length 1/4 inch seam, so I think I'll just do that and I'll check back in when I get that done. The two long sections have been sewn together, and now I'm going to set the seam and press toward the dark fabric. At this point, I like to give the block a light starch. This is a mix of half water, half best press. Is this the best thing to use? I don't know, but I like it. It works for me. It's a very light starch, and getting the fabric slightly damp and then really pressing and holding sets those seams really well, and I think makes a neater block. It makes it a little easier to cut, in my opinion. And you can tell, this is personal, okay guys, but you can tell that these seams are much flatter than these, which I like. But we're definitely not going to overdo it. We're not going to iron back and forth and distort these strips. We want these strips to stay nice and straight. Now that we have this long strip set, we're going to subcut it. To subcut, we're going to trim up this edge and then cut 4.5-inch sections. Now you can, let's get our ruler out. To square up this end, you'll want to line up one of the lines on your rulers with these seams. It may not be exact, but do the best you can do. And then trim a little bit off this edge so it's nice and straight. After that, move your ruler over to the 4.5-inch mark and then cut 4.5-inch segments off of this. Now, that is probably the easiest, potentially the most accurate way to do it, but I hate sewing. I don't hate sewing. Anyway, but I do prefer to cut as little as possible. Let's make life easy for ourselves. So I folded this in half, and when you do that, you're going to need to be really careful. The fabric should match at the top and the bottom and along the sides. The seams need to be really straight. If they're not, if something wacky wonky happened, just cut each individual 4.5-inch section. Now with this, I can cut 2 segments, 2 sets at a time. I've trimmed that off just like before, moved my ruler to the 4.5-inch line. I'm making sure the trimmed end is at the 4.5-inch line, but I'm also keeping an eye on my seams to make sure that they're parallel and everything's nice and neat. So 1 cut, 2 fabrics, 2 little segments. All right, 1 more strip. And then we have a little bit of extra, which you could, when you're making a lot of blocks, you can keep these and, I don't know, make a little pillow out of them or something. And we have that much extra because we did not pre-trim the strips. All right, now we're going to sew all these together. The most important thing, if you want there to be a light, dark pattern across the whole quilt, is to keep a dark patch up in the upper left-hand corner of your block. And then with the next block, it'll be a dark corner up in that left-hand corner too. So it'll just carry on. So we're going to lay it out. In our little stretched 16 patch design. I'm going to sew these 2 together and also these bottom 2 together. So we place them right sides together, and at this point, since this seam allowance is pointing this way and this seam allowance is pointing that way, they nest really well together, and you can pin at each seam intersection. Now, after you make a few of these, and I've made over 100 because they're really, really, really fun, you probably will not need to pin at every intersection. You can start sewing here, and then just as you go, make sure the seams are matched. We're back here at the sewing machine. My stitch length is still on 1.8, and I'm sewing with a 1/4 inch seam. And make sure that top edge is lined up nice, and then start sewing. And as I reach the pins, I take them out. And then as I come to the end, I make sure that this corner the fabric is all lined up on that corner. Now this next segment, I'm going to I'm not going to pin, I'm just going to match the seams with my fingers as I go along. So I can kind of feel that they're nested just perfect there. So I keep my finger down on the seam and just feed it under. Here, I feel it. They're lined right up. There we go. At this point, you can press these seams before sewing the two segments together, but at this point, I'm kind of get excited about finishing it up. So I'm gonna sew these together without pressing. So again, I'm gonna make sure dark is in the upper left-hand corner, and I'm adding it on. Everything's nice and checkerboarded. I match my first seam and then start sewing. Let's go press this and see what it looks like. Before we do the big reveal, I'm going to set all of those seams we just sewed. You can see how they're a little bit ripply, and by pressing them while the seam is still shut, that takes away that ripple and will help everything lay really nice. All right, with these blocks, for them to fit together nicely, we're gonna press all of the blocks up towards the top. And then when you're putting the final quilt together, you can rotate every other block by 180 degrees and they'll nest perfectly. So every block we're going to press up towards the top of the block, which I kind of like because I'm pressing away from myself, which I find is easier than pressing toward myself. So again, I open up the seam with my hand and then use the edge of my iron to press. If you're finding it hard to press these seams or things are looking crazy, you can spray it lightly. Now, how this helps is this loosens up the fibers so that you can really press them down. The problem is it loosens up the fibers so everything can get distorted. So if you do that, it look like I can almost just press it flat with my fingers because it's slightly damp. But you're going to need to be really careful, which is to not move the iron and just do a straight up and down press.
And you can, at the end, do a light press just to get everything really nice, crisp, and all those seams flat. And there we go, a cute stretched 9-patch quilt block. You can download written instructions that have yardage requirements and cutting instructions for a variety of quilt sizes. You can also make this block with 2.5-inch strips, and it makes a super skinny 16 patch. You can go to Stacy Lee Creative's YouTube channel and she'll walk you through how to do that.